And with me now is Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. Premier, welcome back to Primetime Politics.
My pleasure.
So today we're hearing from federal ministers that these carbon pricing changes are a reasonable and flexible answer to some specific circumstances for home heating oil and for Atlantic Canadians as well. We have the Energy Minister, Jonathan Wilkinson, saying there are no more carve-outs coming. What's your reaction to that?
Well, they're really twisting themselves into a pretzel to try to justify something that's unjustifiable. If they're concerned about carbon pricing and carbon emissions, then they shouldn't be giving a reprieve off a much higher emitting type of fuel, which is the heating oil. They should be applying this across the board. If they are concerned about affordability, affordability remains a problem as we get into the winter season in every single province, regardless of what fuel type is used. And so I don't buy their arguments. I think it's just nakedly political that they are trying to win back support in Atlantic Canada. It's inappropriate. They've already essentially said if any province wants a similar reprieve, they've got to vote for more Liberal ministers. It's outrageous, and they really need to apply a system of fairness across the country.
I do also want to ask you something we're hearing today from the federal NDP here in Ottawa, with Leader Jagmeet Singh saying, let's take GST off home heating. That would be a fairer approach across Canada. What do you think of that as an alternative?
There needs to be some reprieve across the board, but this is the whole point. The federal government asserted that they had the right to regulate on carbon pricing because they were going to set a floor price that applied to everyone across the country equally. And they violated that foundational principle that they argued before the Supreme Court. So what we would expect is some consistency, not political game playing. So yes, we all need a reprieve. I can tell you in Saskatchewan, there was a combination of both the NDP and the Saskatchewan Party agreed that they needed to have fairness. Saskatchewan is going one step further, and they said they're not going to be collecting the tax anymore starting in January. In our province, our NDP has also said the same thing. And so the federal government has got this wrong. So they need to correct it. And the best way to correct it is to take the carbon tax completely off home heating. We are a cold winter country. It goes down to minus 30 regularly. They never should have applied it to home heating in the first place. And now's the chance for them to correct it, not just for one region and one type of oil, but for everyone.
Okay, let me dig into your response then from your provincial government. As you mentioned, you and the NDP have a motion talking about inequity across Canada and urging an end to the federal consumer carbon tax. Beyond a motion in the legislature, what more are you prepared to do along the lines of Saskatchewan?
Well, I'm hoping that there is a political answer to this. Saskatchewan and every other province is in a unique position. We have a competitive free enterprise market for our energy system. And so I don't have the same flexibility that somebody who has a crown corporation has. So in Saskatchewan, even Scott Moe recognizes that it probably doesn't conform to the letter of the law, but if in the interest of fairness, he's got to make sure he takes care of his people. I can't ask our private generators and our private operators to break the law, which is why we can't have this patchwork. We can't have this kind of lawlessness where one province gets a reprieve or one region gets a reprieve from the federal government, another province goes its own way, all because the federal government says that they've asserted the right to be able to set a carbon price across the country. They've got to set an equal, fair carbon price across the country. They're not doing that, and it's up to them to come up with a political solution. We'll be pressing them for that.
Okay, now you did say yesterday that your government was looking for legal advice on this federal decision. So tell me more about what avenues are you looking at? Is this another court reference on carbon pricing that we could see coming?
Well, I had been told when I first got elected that the court normally does not like to hear a review of a case that they've just rendered a decision on, as they did in 2021. But I have to tell you that if the federal government is going to undermine its own arguments about why it is they needed to set a federal carbon floor price, then it seems to me that that allows us to go back to court and say, this isn't what they argued. This isn't the reason why they said that they should have this power, so that they could play favorites and be able to set differential prices for differential products across the country. That's outrageous. That's not how our confederation is supposed to work. They're being very divisive, very damaging. And if they're not going to apply it equally, then I'm going to be seeking some legal advice about whether or not we can get the court to reconsider that case. If their argument is now that the carbon pricing is so onerous that it's putting people at risk as we get into winter, that is an argument that applies equally in this province. And so if it cannot be justified in Atlantic Canada, I assure you it cannot be justified in Alberta either.
I want to ask you on the subject of the Supreme Court, because I know you've been talking a lot about that recent opinion on Bill C-69 on the Impact Assessment Act. Now, of course, that opinion deals specifically with elements of that act, designated projects versus projects under federal purview. Do you think that decision on the Constitution and the division of powers could potentially apply here?
I'm willing to test it. I mean, I think, again, as long as the federal government is applying their policies equally, I think they're on solid ground. For instance, they've always had a federal fuel tax, but they don't charge the federal fuel tax differently in different provinces. The way they are now contemplating doing with the carbon tax, it's ludicrous. And so if they're going to be doing that kind of action, I think that undermines their argument about why this needs to be set federally. If their argument is, well, we have to take into account regional differences, well, doesn't that just underscore why it is these decisions should be left to the provinces? If we have to have regional nuance and regional policies that make sense based on the geographic realities that are happening in each region, then that's by definition a provincial matter that should be left in our hands. And so I'm prepared to see if we can get some legal analysis. We've begun that process. And if they don't come up with a political solution, we'll see if we can go forward and get a new reference.
All right, we have a few moments left, and I do want to shift to your government's speech from the throne delivered yesterday. Of course, pensions have been a big issue in your province, but no mention of that in the speech. Why not mention a potential Alberta pension plan yesterday as your government delivered its agenda?
Well, as I've always said, we needed to issue the report so that people could see what we saw about what the Pension Act says about what we're entitled to if we do end up setting up our own pension plan. But I've also equally said that any decision on setting up a pension plan would go to a referendum. And we're not sure as of yet, because we're only partway through our consultation, whether Albertans have an appetite for a referendum. So we're going to allow that consultation to continue on. And we'll make a decision once we have a better idea about whether or not our people even want to have a vote on it.
So is the fact that there is opposition inside your province to potentially leaving the Canada Pension Plan giving you pause now?
I guess what I would say is that the federal government hasn't come back. They said they don't like our calculation. They don't agree with it, but they haven't offered a counter. And what I've heard through our consultations is that people want to know exactly what the asset transfer will be. So our next step is going to be to get that answer from the federal government. And if they won't give it to us, from the CPPIB Investment Board, and if they won't give it to us, then we'll have to go to court, because I think that's what people want to understand, is what the asset transfer would look like, because then we'll have a better idea of what the reduction in premiums will be or what the increase in benefits will be. So we're going to commit to that work, and I hope that the federal government gives us their response.
Okay, now right at the start of your speech yesterday, your government promises to use your Sovereignty Act several times in the coming months if the federal government continues down its current path on emissions and energy. So can you be a bit more specific? What are the red lines for you that would lead to this act being used in the upcoming months?
I've been very specific all the way back to the leadership race when I first proposed the Sovereignty Act. If they put in an arbitrary cap on oil and natural gas emissions, as they've threatened to, 42% reduction by 2030, that's a red line. If they bring through an arbitrary cap on fertilizer emissions, which they have threatened to, 30% reduction by 2030, that's a hard line. If they bring through a hard cap on emissions from methane, as they've threatened to do, that would be a hard line. And if they proceed with unrealistic expectations or unrealistic targets to have a net zero power grid by 2035, we know we can't do that. That would be a hard line. So those would be the four circumstances, and we're trying to work with them. I told the Prime Minister from the first moment that I spoke with him that I was aligned with getting to carbon neutrality by 2050. I told him that we were going to do an emissions reduction plan, which we did. We released it in April. I asked him if he would work with us to set up a table so that we could have our two governments work together on figuring out how we can align our policies. They've met several times. And so now it's with the Supreme Court at our back saying, yes, the Constitution matters. Yes, these are things that are in provincial jurisdiction. I think that they should be working more collaboratively with us to align at 2050. They cannot take unilateral action here. And those would be the circumstances.
Okay, very quickly, I want to ask you one last question about your legislative agenda. Your first bill promises a referendum before any rise in personal or business taxes. Does that open up more potential for you to have to perhaps de-index tax rates from inflation if there's fiscal crunch? How are you going to handle your provincial finances if there are economic issues and you are looking for revenue?
Well, here's the promise that we have made is that people know that the rates that they have right now will never be higher. We're going to make sure that if rates were ever increased, it would be put to the people. If basic personal income tax exemptions for both personal and spousal equivalent were ever lowered, so people would be paying more, that would also have to go to a referendum. So we want to give certainty to people that the environment that they see themselves today will never be worse than it is right now. And that if any future government wants to make a change, they'd have to put it to a referendum in the same way that we've had legislation around sales tax. If any government wants to impose a sales tax, they have to ask the people first.
Okay. Premier Danielle Smith, thanks again for your time.
You bet. My pleasure.